So I'll just give you a little bit of background about the LDA in case people don't really know what it is. We're relatively fresh, we're a startup, we're 8 months old. So I'll just take you through a bit of what we're about, where we've got to date. Then I'll go on to talk about how does the LDA relate to affordable housing, and more specifically, how are we looking at the whole community-led housing space at the moment. So we were set up last September, and we were set up under a thing called a statutory instrument, but we are going to have our own act. So there's an LDA bill drafted at the moment. We're trying to get through a couple of technical issues with our colleagues in the Attorney General's office, but we're getting there. But really, I guess when you think about land, and just as I was, before I came up here, I was just having a glance at this really good and interesting pamphlet. And I guess a lot of the thinking and the books being read about land and the economics of land were the same ones that are mentioned in the pamphlet and others. And it's really to see, to go to the core of what's our relationship with land, and I guess how to smooth out the boom-bust nature of land markets, which has really been at the core of the housing problems that we've had in this country, I think, over the past 20 or 30 years. And one way to do that is to look at how we use state land. Before we go throwing stones, to look in our own backyard and see how we deal with our own land. And I guess up until now, various state bodies own land, the Department of Defence, the HSE, and various others, and they have their own jobs to do. They have to provide security services, health services. And for the first time, I guess, we were bringing a kind of a helicopter holistic view about how we think about that land, because to be fair to Defence or HSE, they don't care really about delivering housing. But if we have someone sitting over that, well, maybe those services could be carried out somewhere else. Maybe they're where they are now for a legacy reason. Maybe we should be putting housing where some of those services are currently been run. So really, I guess what we're trying to achieve is the compact growth agenda that's in Project Ireland 2040 as a result of taking that holistic view, and to make the most use of our infrastructure and to regenerate our core city areas. We do have an ambition to go beyond state land and to play a role in opening up private land as well, and to help make that more accessible, cheaper, and more stable in terms of price. The way in which we can do that might be through, say, for instance, opening up private sector land that might be adjacent to state land, or it could be through the provision of infrastructure, which, as anyone in the building trade will know, is a really, really big issue in terms of opening up land for development. And of course, if we're going to do that, we look for a quid pro quo. We may look to see, can we get affordable housing or other things on that land as well. So the starting point is, what do we own? When we went to look at that initially, the answer was, we're not quite sure, we're not fully sure what land we own. So now, to be fair, I think intuitively we've a pretty good idea as a state, but there was no common database that was regularly updated. Even if we did know where was a piece of land, who owned it, what institution owned it, was there any debt on it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the first task we have is really to set up a state land database. We have someone working full-time on that. We've really good people in from the housing agency seconded into the LDA on that. So again, thanks to John O'Connor from the housing agency I saw earlier on. But really, I guess, why were we set up? And it's all about affordability. So it's to smooth land over time, of course, and the private sector has a role in that too, in private sector delivery. But we're looking to see how could we impact most on affordability of accommodation, be it rental or be it purchase accommodation, and really that's why we're set up. If affordability wasn't a problem, I wouldn't be here today, the LDA wouldn't exist. That's probably the best way to put it. So really we want to challenge the status quo, to go in and ask the questions, should that facility be there that the state is currently operating, or can we think about it in a different way, and to not just turn away anytime we're told that, well, no, we need that operation there for a particular reason, we can't move it elsewhere, etc., etc. It's to really dig in and understand really does something have to be where it is, and could we open it up, say, for housing or other sustainable development? So with 3 strategic pillars, and the first one is countering the boom and bust relationship we have with land in Ireland, and to disrupt the land market. When you think about competition in development, it can happen in housing delivery, let's say. It can happen in 3 areas, is the way I see it. So that's competing for land acquisition, innovation through development and competing on the actual building of homes, and then on the selling of them, be them through renters or purchasers. So that's broadly where the competition happens. And especially if anyone's paying close attention to the Irish Times on Wednesdays, where you have the commercial property supplement, land is where the competitive focus is at the moment, and that's where I see it. When you've big money been paid for land. I remember from my NAMA days, we had land assets. We couldn't give them away 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Now they're trading for 150,000 per apartment unit. And I can tell you numerous examples, and you can probably think of them yourselves. So that's really where the reason for that is competition. So people want to come in, build, sell for profit or operate for profit, and they pay big to access those opportunities. So it's competition for land, and we really want to shift it away from there as much as possible to put it into housing development. The other thing is to change our housing choices, so to provide more affordable accommodation. And I guess that's not just an ethos, it's a requirement in a way, because the government has stipulated that any state land that we access must have at least 30% affordable accommodation on it, in addition to the Part 5 standard of 10%. But in actuality, it'll go beyond that, because many bodies like the Housing Agency and the local authorities, where we're sourcing land or opening up land or working in partnership with them, may require almost entirely affordable by composition on those land areas. So really that's at the core of what we're about. And we want to look for ideas we don't have an affordable housing sector really in this country by designation yet. So we want to foster new ideas, be champions of them, to help pilot them. So that's what I think about with things like co-housing, cost rental, community-led housing. And that leads into, I guess, champions of innovation, and that can be in the space of sustainable or affordable housing, but it can also be in construction methodology. Say, for instance, should we be looking at factory or off-site construction, especially when there's such pressure on the contractor industry at the moment. And I can tell you that we're factoring in pretty significant pre-tender inflation values into our financial modelling at the moment, which we prefer not to have to do, because that ultimately ups the delivery price. So the arrow at the bottom means that, I guess, aside from having some good ideas and fact-based research, we are somewhat well positioned, similar to the local authorities, I guess, as well, that we can take those ideas and start to pilot them and implement them on land that we have access to through the state or otherwise. So I think there's a good opportunity there. So just on a bit more detail, what does that mean on the day-to-day that we're doing? We're active on 9 sites. When I mean active, we're looking at planning applications. We have architect-led design teams are about to be appointed, and we've about 10 more that we're in discussions. We're trending 5,000 units ish at the moment, but I'd have good confidence that we'll access more than that, given that we're only in existence about 8 months. We are looking at city strategies at the moment, and this is a big thing for us, because I guess development plans take a 6-year view, but we want to look and take a 20-year view, a 25-year view, because while short-term delivery is really important to us, I think it's over the long term that the LDA is going to be really most impactfully felt. And that's why we want to say, well, what should we be buying today that's going to be opened up in 10 years, 15 years? And I mean, you blink and 10 years goes by, and I think we have to be thinking in those terms to take that long-term view. I skipped one there, development on state land. As I mentioned, we're working on planning applications, but construction probably commencing next year. The affordable mechanisms that we're looking at as well is a key area of activity, because we have a contractual obligation, be it through local authorities, housing agency, or state lands, to deliver affordable housing. And the question is, how do we do that? So I can't go to my board and say, can we have 50 or 100 million to build out a housing scheme without knowing how it's going to operate afterwards. So those mechanisms are critical for us to be developed through the course of this year, and that can include co-housing. The state lands database I mentioned, and perhaps an urban regeneration implementer role, and that's the strategic areas. How can we have a role in taking something akin to a strategic development zone and going beyond just a planning scheme for that to be an implementer to make sure that they get delivered. And that's what I talk about, infrastructure investment and so on, that we can play a role there. We've a lot of spinning plates going on at the moment because we're short-staffed, but I'm glad to say we will have 15 by the end of the year. And we have been advertising lately for head of urban planning, for which goes back to our city strategies, and development people as well. So when you map that day-to-day activity, my chairman keeps saying to me, how do I know what I'm doing every day is leading towards the bigger picture? So we just try and map in what we're doing to make sure that we're achieving what we're trying to do in terms of changing how we can offer affordable housing to people, and to change how the land market in Ireland works as well. So just moving on to affordability and what are our thoughts on that. So I mentioned that we have to have at least 30%. So that's baked in into our existence. So there's a lot of challenges, and I guess the question that I often ask it, and we often get asked, is what is affordable housing? You know, who's it affordable for? Does that mean everything else is unaffordable? These questions need to be teased out. We're working with the Department of Housing on that to try and understand that a bit better. And can we have a structure around what affordable housing is? We have a social housing policy framework. Could we have an affordable housing policy framework? And I think that's really, really important, and I think that's recognised as well by the department, to be fair. And there's some good people working on that at the moment, but it's complex. I mean, and I'll talk about some of those challenges in a minute. How do we justify financing these homes? Derek mentioned that it's public money. There's a lot of accountability, and we have to demonstrate that there's value for money there, while achieving the, I guess, policy obligations and objectives of affordable housing. So it's a pretty thin line to walk on sometimes. So that's something that presents a challenge for us. And how do we make the homes affordable? Well, the obvious place to look for is land, as we see it. And but are there other ways that we can do it through innovative financing structures as well? And how will the model work? How is it administered? Who gets access to it? There's going to be more demand than supply, especially in the early stages. So these are, I would characterise as obstacles to be knocked down, and we're willing to put the effort into doing that. We think we have a significant role. The big thing is where does the land come from? And I guess if you're looking for land that's going to go in for free or near free to make housing affordable, it's probably going to be from the state in some shape or form. So we're set up to access state land. So we think we have a role there. We've been given some money to start off with. We've been allocated $1.25 billion, which sounds like a lot, but you wouldn't be long getting through that if you got through 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 houses. It's important to manage that well as well, and to make sure that we're off the government balance sheet. But we want permanent affordability, and that's where we're trying to get to. So cost rental is something that we're looking at quite closely and strongly. And we do like that because we think it's sustainable. There's proven models elsewhere. We like the scalability of it. And I think that has big potential in this country if we can get our land question right. And it could look like, say, we access state lands, we work with local authorities and set up some sort of an institutional platform to deliver this. And our colleagues in NESC, National Economic and Social Council, have been very strong on the need for an institutional driver to drive things like cost rental, because without that, we won't have the financing structures and we won't have the scale. We're really interested in co-housing and community-led housing as well, because cost rental doesn't necessarily. It works better in some areas than others. And we also like the idea of having sustainable communities where occupiers have a vested interest and an ownership in the asset as well. We do like that, and we think that can play a very important part in sustainable communities where perhaps if there's rental as well, that it just adds that bit of stability on an ongoing basis. So we are really interested in that. Some of the challenges we see are the relative scalability, because there's a barrier to entry, I guess, and one of the points on this excellent pamphlet is that can we get mortgage lenders to finance interests in leaseholds of wider schemes? And I think that's critical because, again, going back to the money question, if we go and firstly we want something to be successful, but then secondly, if it's going to be successful, it has to be financeable, and we have to make sure with the banking industry, I believe, that finance products are available to feed in and support these. And I think co-housing, and I think if you can do that, I think there's great potential in it. And just briefly, these are my own views only, so don't throw any tomatoes at me. But just when you compare, say, cost rental and community-led housing or community land trust, say, for instance, to cost rental, how they stack up in my mind, there's pros and cons for each. I think the cost rental financial aspect is a bit more developed than the CLTs at the moment for the point I just made mainly, and perhaps a bit more scalable. But then again, the CLTs win out on ownership opportunities and the sustainable communities. But as well as that, the whole of life aspect, and when people challenge me on cost rental and say, well, what does someone do when they get to 65? They stop earning and they're still going to have to pay rent and they've no home asset to live in. I think CLTs probably look a bit better when you stack it up against that. But I don't think it's one or the other. I think there's room for both. And that's why we're really interested in developing ideas around this a bit more. So the challenges are there, but we got the benefits on the right-hand side, we've got to overcome them. We see them as challenges to be knocked down. And one of the big aspects is around two key ones, financing, and as well as that, the administration. Who gets involved, who's allowed access, who are we targeting, etc. So just to wrap it up, we want to support new ways for affordable housing. We'd love to be at the coalface of this, and we think that CLTs and similar structures are something that can work for us. There are challenges, of course, but there's challenges with everything worthwhile, so we're willing to work to try and get across those. So thanks for listening.